It was 11:47 p.m. on December 15th, 1975, and Earl Thompson was about to turn off the lights of Thompson's Diner for the last time. The snow was falling harder now, turning the empty parking lot into a white wasteland that matched the emptiness in his chest. At 68 years old, Earl had fought in Korea, raised 3 children, and kept this diner running for 23 years. But tonight, all of that was ending. The foreclosure notice was tucked in his coat pocket, along with the keys he would hand over to the bank in the morning. 23 years of serving coffee to truckers, breakfast to families, and late-night meals to anyone who needed them. All of it would disappear because Earl couldn't keep up with the payments after his wife Helen died 8 months ago. Helen had been the heart of this place. She remembered every customer's name, knew how they liked their eggs, asked about their children. Without her warm smile and gentle conversations, customers slowly stopped coming. The new interstate bypass didn't help either. Traffic that once flowed past Thompson's Diner now roared past 5 miles away, taking the travelers with it. Earl walked behind the counter one last time, his arthritic hands running along the worn formica surface where Helen had worked beside him for so many years. He was about to reach for the light switch when he saw headlights struggling through the storm outside. A car was pulling into the parking lot, moving slowly, carefully. Earl watched as it rolled to a stop near the front door. Through the swirling snow, he could make out a single figure inside. Earl hesitated. He had already cleaned the grill, washed the dishes, counted what little money was in the register. He was exhausted, heartbroken, and ready to walk away from everything. It would have been so easy to pretend he hadn't seen the car, to turn off the lights and slip out the back door. But 68 years of life had taught Earl Thompson something important. A man's character isn't measured by what he does when it's convenient. It's measured by what he does when it costs him something. Earl flicked the open sign back on and unlocked the front door. The man who stepped through that door was tall, broad-shouldered, and completely soaked from the short walk through the storm. Snow clung to his dark coat and melted on his shoulders as he stood in the doorway, shivering. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," the stranger said, his voice warm despite the cold. "My car broke down about 2 miles back. I've been walking, looking for somewhere to wait out this storm." Earl noticed the man's accent immediately, not quite Southern, but with that distinctive cadence he'd heard on television. The stranger was younger than Earl, maybe in his early 30s, with intelligent eyes and an athletic build that suggested he took care of himself. Come in," Earl said, waving the man inside. "You'll freeze to death out there. Sit wherever you like." The stranger chose a booth near the window, though there wasn't much to see outside except the endless snow. Earl brought over a clean towel and a steaming cup of coffee without being asked. "Name's Earl Thompson," he said, extending his hand. "This is my place." "Well, was my place." "Muhammad," the stranger replied, accepting the handshake with a firm grip. "Muhammad Ali, and thank you for this. I know you were closing up." Earl nodded, not immediately registering the name. He'd heard it before, certainly, but his mind was focused on the basic human needs in front of him. A cold man who needed warmth, a stranded traveler who needed shelter. "You hungry?" Earl asked. "I already cleaned the grill, but I could make you a sandwich. Got some good turkey left over from today." Muhammad smiled, and there was something about that smile that lit up his whole face. "That would be wonderful, Mr. Thompson. I don't want to put you to any trouble, though." "No trouble at all," Earl said, though privately he wondered why he was going to all this effort on his last night. Maybe because, after 23 years of feeding people, it felt wrong to stop now. As Earl moved around the kitchen, preparing a sandwich and heating some soup, he found himself stealing glances at his unexpected customer. There was something familiar about the man, but Earl couldn't place it. Muhammad sat quietly, occasionally sipping his coffee, looking out at the storm with a thoughtful expression. "So what brings you through our little town?" Earl asked as he set the food down. "Not many people stop here anymore since they built the new highway." Muhammad took a bite of the sandwich and closed his eyes appreciatively. "This is excellent, Mr. Thompson. Really excellent." He paused, seeming to consider the question. "I was driving to a speaking engagement in Chicago. Sometimes I like to take the back roads, see parts of the country that most people miss." "Speaking engagement?" Earl asked, settling into the booth across from his customer. At this point, he figured, what was the hurry? This was his last night anyway. I talk to young people mostly about finding their purpose, standing up for what they believe in, that sort of thing. Muhammad's voice carried a weight that suggested he'd done plenty of both. Earl studied the young man more carefully. There was definitely something about him, a confidence, a presence that filled the small diner, even when he was sitting still and speaking softly. That's good work, Earl said. Young people need guidance these days. World's changing so fast it's hard to know what to hold on to. Muhammad nodded thoughtfully. What about you, Mr. Thompson? How long have you been running this place? 23 years, Earl replied, then found himself adding, Tonight's my last night. Something in Earl's voice made Muhammad look up sharply from his sandwich. Last night? You're retiring? Earl laughed, but there was no humor in it. Not by choice. Bank's foreclosing tomorrow. Can't keep up with the payments since my wife passed. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Muhammad set down his sandwich and leaned forward slightly, his full attention now focused on Earl. I'm sorry for your loss, Muhammad said quietly. How long were you married? 43 years, Earl said, surprised by how easily the words came. He hadn't talked about Helen with anyone since the funeral. She was the real heart of this place. I just cooked the food and fixed things when they broke. Helen made people feel at home. Muhammad was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting something that looked like understanding. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. Tell me about her. And Earl did. For the next hour, as the storm raged outside and the warmth of the diner cocooned them from the world, Earl found himself talking about Helen in a way he hadn't since she died. He told Muhammad about how they'd met at a church dance in 1951, how she'd insisted on buying the diner when it went up for sale, how she'd worked 16-hour days beside him without ever complaining. Muhammad listened with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions, laughing at the funny stories and offering quiet sympathy for the painful ones. There was something about his presence that made conversation feel safe, natural. She sounds like an extraordinary woman, Muhammad said when Earl finally paused. The kind of person who makes the world better just by being in it. Earl felt tears threatening for the first time in months. She was, and without her, I couldn't keep going. These last 8 months, every day felt like pushing a boulder uphill. Muhammad nodded slowly. I understand that feeling. When you lose someone who's been your anchor, everything else feels meaningless. Have you lost someone close? Earl asked, sensing pain in the younger man's voice. In a way, Muhammad said quietly, sometimes the hardest losses aren't death. Sometimes they're the people who walk away when you make difficult choices. Earl sensed there was a story there, but he didn't push. Instead, he refilled their coffee cups and settled back into the conversation. As the hours passed, their discussion deepened. Muhammad asked about Earl's time in Korea, and Earl found himself talking about the war in ways he never had, about the fear, the bonds between soldiers, the way combat changes a man. Muhammad shared his own thoughts about violence and conflict, about finding strength through struggle. You know, Muhammad said at one point, what you did in Korea, serving your country even when you were scared, that took real courage. Earl shook his head. I was just doing what had to be done. Real courage is what you're doing, talking to young people about standing up for their beliefs. That takes guts. Muhammad smiled. Maybe we both have our own kind of courage, Mr. Thompson. Around 3 a.m., as they were talking about the importance of community, Earl finally asked the question that had been nagging at him all night. Muhammad, I keep feeling like I should know you from somewhere. Are you someone famous? Muhammad's smile grew wider, and there was mischief in his eyes. Well, Mr. Thompson, I am the heavyweight boxing champion of the world. Earl blinked, processing this information. Then he started laughing, really laughing for the first time in months. Muhammad Ali, he said, shaking his head. I should have recognized you. My grandson's got your poster on his bedroom wall. Does that change anything? Muhammad asked quietly. Earl considered this seriously. Did it change anything? He looked across the table at the man who had spent the last 4 hours listening to his stories, sharing his own thoughts, treating Earl with respect and kindness. The man who had never once acted like he was too important to be trapped in a small-town diner with an old man on the worst night of his life. No, Earl said finally. It doesn't change anything. You're still the same person who's been sitting here talking with me all night. Still the same person who listened to me ramble about Helen and didn't make me feel foolish for grieving. Mohammed's smile was radiant. You know, Mr. Thompson, that might be the nicest thing anyone said to me in a long time. What do you mean? Most people, when they find out who I am, everything changes. They want autographs, pictures, stories about famous fights. They stop seeing me as a person and start seeing me as a celebrity. But you're still just talking to me like I'm Mohammed, the guy whose car broke down in the storm. Earl shrugged. That's who you are to me. The fact that you can also beat people up for a living is just your job. Mohammed laughed out loud at that. Beat people up for a living. Helen would have liked that description. She would have, Earl agreed. She would have liked you too. She always said the measure of a person wasn't what they did for work, but how they treated people when nobody was watching. Smart woman. The smartest. As dawn began to break, the storm finally started to ease. Earl realized he had been talking for over 6 hours straight, and somehow, for the first time since Helen's death, he didn't feel completely alone. I should probably call someone to come get you, Earl said reluctantly. Storm's letting up. Actually, Mohammed said, pulling out a small notebook from his coat pocket, would you mind if I made a phone call first? There's something I'd like to do. Earl gestured toward the payphone near the front door. Help yourself. Mohammed made 3 phone calls, speaking quietly but with obvious urgency. Earl couldn't hear the conversations, but he could see the intensity on Mohammed's face as he spoke. When Mohammed returned to the booth, there was something different about his expression, something that looked almost like excitement. Mr. Thompson, Mohammed said, I want to ask you something. What would it take to keep this place open? Earl laughed bitterly. About $15,000 to catch up on the mortgage, and then enough steady customers to make the monthly payments. Neither one of which I have. What if you had both? Earl looked at Mohammed suspiciously. What are you getting at? What if I told you that by this afternoon there would be a line of customers stretching down the street, all wanting to eat at Thompson's Diner? I'd say you hit your head when your car broke down. Mohammed grinned. Mr. Thompson, you showed me kindness tonight when you had every reason to turn me away. You shared your grief with me, your memories of Helen, your fears about the future. You treated me like a human being instead of a boxing trophy. That kind of goodness shouldn't be rewarded with losing everything you've worked for. That's kind of you to say, but those phone calls I just made, Mohammed interrupted, were to some people who can help. By noon today, word is going to get out that Muhammad Ali spent the night at Thompson's Diner, and that it's the best food and the warmest hospitality in 3 states. Earl stared at him. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious, and that's just the beginning. Muhammad reached into his coat and pulled out a checkbook. Earl watched in amazement as he wrote out a check and slid it across the table. The check was made out to Thompson's Diner for $25,000. I can't accept this, Earl said immediately, pushing the check back. Yes, you can, and you will. Muhammad's voice was gentle but firm. Mr. Thompson, last night you saved my life. Your car broke down. I gave you a sandwich. No, Muhammad said quietly. You did much more than that. You see, I wasn't really driving to Chicago for a speaking engagement. I was driving away from Chicago. I was driving away from everything. Earl frowned. What do you mean? Muhammad was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the lightening sky. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. The past few years have been difficult. I've made choices that cost me friends, opportunities, the respect of people I cared about. Sometimes when you stand up for what you believe in, you end up standing alone. And lately, I've been feeling very alone. He turned to look at Earl directly. Last night, I was driving through the storm, and I was seriously considering whether any of it was worth it, whether I should just disappear, give up fighting, give up speaking out, give up trying to make a difference. Earl felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Then my car broke down, Muhammad continued, and I found this little diner with the lights still on, and inside was a man who had every reason to be bitter, who was losing everything he cared about, but who still opened his door to a stranger, who still showed kindness when he had nothing left to lose. Muhammad's voice strengthened as he spoke. You reminded me why any of this matters, Mr. Thompson. You reminded me that there are still good people in the world, people worth fighting for. People like Helen who make the world better just by being in it. People like you who choose kindness even when life has been unkind to them. Earl felt tears running down his cheeks and didn't care. So that check isn't charity, Muhammad said firmly. It's payment for saving my life. It's payment for reminding me who I'm supposed to be. By 10 o'clock that morning, cars were beginning to pull into the parking lot of Thompson's diner. By noon, there was indeed a line stretching down the street. Word had spread through networks Earl didn't understand. Sports reporters, fans, people who just wanted to see the place where Muhammad Ali had spent the storm. Earl found himself completely overwhelmed, trying to serve dozens of customers with equipment he'd thought he'd never use again. Then Muhammad appeared behind the counter, wearing one of Helen's old aprons. "What are you doing?" Earl asked. "Working," Muhammad said simply. "You hired me as your cook, remember?" "I never hired you as anything," Muhammad grinned. "Details, Mr. Thompson, details." For the rest of that incredible day, the heavyweight champion of the world worked as a short-order cook at Thompson's Diner. He flipped pancakes, scrambled eggs, and charmed customers with the same charisma that made him famous in the boxing ring. But more importantly, he gave Earl something he hadn't had in 8 months: hope. Every customer who came that day heard the story of how Earl had opened his door to a stranger on the worst night of his life. They heard about Helen, about the diner's history, about the kind of place where people still cared about each other. Muhammad made sure they heard those stories. Between taking orders and serving food, he told everyone who would listen about Earl Thompson's generosity, about the man who had saved his life by simply treating him like a human being. "This isn't just a diner," Muhammad would tell the crowds. "This is proof that kindness still exists in the world. Earl Thompson and his wife Helen built something special here, and we need to make sure it survives." By the end of that first day, Earl had taken in more money than he usually made in a month. But the money was only part of what Muhammad had given him. He had given him back his sense of purpose. 3 days later, a local television crew arrived to interview Earl and Muhammad about their unlikely friendship. Muhammad insisted that Earl do most of the talking, that this was Earl's story, not his. "What people need to understand," Muhammad told the cameras, "is that Mr. Thompson here represents everything good about America. He's a veteran who served his country, a husband who loved his wife, a businessman who treated his customers like family. When my car broke down that night, I didn't find a diner. I found the heart of what this country is supposed to be." The interview aired on national television. Within a week, Thompson's Diner was featured in magazines and newspapers across the country. People began making pilgrimages to the small town, not just to see where Muhammad Ali had worked as a cook, but to meet the man who had shown kindness to a stranger on his darkest night. Earl found himself busier than he had been in years. He hired back his old staff and brought in new employees to handle the crowds. But he never forgot the lesson Muhammad had taught him. It wasn't about the fame or the customers. It was about treating each person who walked through his door like they mattered. Muhammad kept his promise to stay in touch. He called Earl every few weeks, checking on the diner, asking about the customers, sharing stories from his own life. Sometimes he would stop by unannounced when he was traveling, always insisting on working a shift in the kitchen. "It keeps me grounded," Muhammad explained to Earl one day. "When I'm here flipping burgers and talking to regular people, I remember why any of the other stuff matters." The friendship that began on that snowy night became one of the most meaningful relationships in both men's lives. Earl became a confidant for Muhammad, someone who knew him before he became a legend, someone who saw him as just Muhammad, the guy whose car broke down in a storm. Muhammad became the son Earl had never had, the reminder that there was still good in the world, that kindness was still worth the risk. In 1981, when Muhammad fought his last professional fight, Earl flew to Las Vegas to watch from ringside. It was the first time he had ever been on an airplane, the first time he had left his home state since the Korean War. After the fight, as Muhammad sat in his dressing room, battered and exhausted, Earl was one of the first people to see him. "You fought with honor," Earl told him simply. "Helen would have been proud." Muhammad smiled through his swollen lips. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. That means more to me than you know." When Muhammad was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, Earl was devastated. He watched his friend's speech slow, his movements become labored. his once magnificent physical presence diminished by illness. But Muhammad's spirit remained unbroken. He continued to visit Thompson's diner when he could, continued to call Earl regularly, continued to remind everyone he met about the importance of kindness. "The disease can take my voice," Muhammad told Earl during one visit, "but it can't take what we learned that night. It can't take the truth that one person's kindness can change everything." Earl ran Thompson's diner until he was 82 years old, finally retiring in 1989. By then, the restaurant had become a landmark, a destination for people from around the world who wanted to see where Muhammad Ali had learned the true meaning of hospitality. When Earl died peacefully in his sleep in 1995, Muhammad Ali was one of the pallbearers at his funeral. The service was held in the small-town church where Earl and Helen had been married, and it was packed with people whose lives had been touched by the simple kindness of a man who opened his door during a storm. Muhammad spoke at the service, his voice already showing the effects of Parkinson's, but his words clear and strong. "Earl Thompson saved my life," Muhammad said to the gathered mourners. "Not because he fed me or sheltered me, but because he reminded me what human goodness looks like. He showed me that true strength isn't about winning fights or earning fame. It's about choosing compassion when you have every reason to choose otherwise." Muhammad paused, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the podium. Helen Thompson used to say that the measure of a person was how they treated people when nobody was watching. That night in December 1975, Earl thought nobody was watching. He was wrong. I was watching. America was watching. And what we saw was the very best of what we can be. Today, Thompson's Diner is still open, run by Earl's grandson and his family. The booth where Earl and Muhammad spent that snowy night is preserved exactly as it was, with a small plaque that reads, "On December 15, 1975, two strangers became friends here, and both their lives were changed forever." People still come from around the world to sit in that booth, to order the same turkey sandwich that Earl made for Muhammad that night, to be reminded that kindness is the most powerful force in the world. The story of that night has been told and retold, but the truth of it remains simple. When one person chooses to help another without expectation or reward, miracles can happen. Muhammad Ali became a global icon, a symbol of courage and conviction. But he never forgot that his greatest victory didn't happen in a boxing ring. It happened in a small-town diner when an old man chose kindness over convenience and reminded a lost champion of who he was meant to be. Earl Thompson died as he had lived, with dignity and grace, surrounded by people who loved him. But his legacy lives on every time someone chooses to help a stranger, every time someone opens their door to someone in need, every time someone remembers that we are all just travelers looking for shelter from the storm. On December 15, 1975, a snowstorm brought together a broken-hearted diner owner and a heavyweight champion who had lost his way. By morning, both men had found something they thought was lost forever: hope, purpose, and the unshakable knowledge that kindness, true kindness, never goes unanswered. That is the real championship. That is the victory that matters most. That is why, more than 40 years later, people still make pilgrimages to a small-town diner where two strangers became friends and changed each other's lives forever.